I was wondering what protections or policy changes are needed to scale up projects like that, and then just protect the ability for those projects to continue or to start, and then also make sure that scaling up these renewables doesn't come at the cost of indigenous land rights, food sovereignty, or community self-determination.
Yeah, what kind of policy changes? Sorry, I'm not sure I got the question. Yeah.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah, what protections, policy changes, just what do you think needs to be in place both from like a government level? I know that depends very much on where you're located in the world. But yeah, essentially, how can we protect these projects and make sure they can still flourish?
yeah. So I mean, I think th there are different levels of kinds of policy changes. And I think what we have realized in doing this work is that you need kind of multi-sectoral, like a suite of policies and like, many different types of public policies in order to allow the right kind of renewables to flourish. And you cannot focus only on climate policy or on just industrial policy or on kind of green economic policy. It needs to be have a kind of multi-sectoral approach. And that's why some people, it's a tricky term, but some movements and organizations have started using the terminology of just transition to try to encompass kind of what this looks like in the round. It's a very contested term because it's also kind of very co-opted, and just transition is in some places has become about um, false solutions and gas and hydrogen and all this kind of stuff. But so I think so by which I mean you need good public finance. So I talked about this. What is the financial policy? So we need grant-based public financing for the energy transition and for finance to flow from global north to south. And this is a condition without which we will never be able to see the transition, because if you look at the broader scheme of things, like the vast, I don't know if it's a majority, but certainly a large number of countries in the global south are actually heavily in debt. They're facing kind of sovereign debt crises. And so the amount that they spend on servicing debt is far more than anything they can invest, even in the most basic public services, education. So investing in a genuine, community-led energy transition is not on the table at all. If you're talking about like updating your grid, if you're talking about going out into communities, all the things that if you want a state-led, kind of a kind of state-led project, it's very difficult to do that without the right kind of financing. So that's super important. Then, of course, in terms of protections, they are at many different levels. Some of the basic kind of land and natural resource protections, so land rights. Implementing genuine free, prior, and informed consent and indigenous peoples' rights. The UN conventions, but then also other types of rights, so kind of economic, democratic rights, like people's right to protest. One of the big issues that we face is kind of criminalization of communities who are who are protesting, mega projects of renewables. It's a really big problem. And so, for example, there is a statistic, I'm just trying to think. So on critical minerals, for example, there's an organization that is tracking um, criminalization and human rights violations from critical minerals projects. And it's like 60% of the projects that they assessed have, serious human rights violations in terms of like criminalization, killings, extrajudicial. So, all these types of protections are super important in terms of dignified jobs, and what is your transition plan for workers. et cetera, et cetera. In terms of policy changes, well, I mean, I think so. A lot of many parts of the world, so like the US, the UK to some extent, do have now some kind of green industrial policy, right? So that does exist. But I think it is looking at the policy in terms of also what is its global impact. Like what is, what does it mean to have, because of course, yeah, you can go ahead and like they do now, the EU, for example, has this kind of what's called the new it's strategy on Critical Minerals Act. And it's basically an act of the EU Parliament and of the Council that identifies strategic critical minerals projects across the world and inside Europe and like focuses that for public investment, for tax breaks, for all this kind of stuff. But the question is, what is that in line with the EU's fair share of what they should have, right? What does it look like for that policy to exist in the world? Um, and I mean, obviously, in terms of policies, there are many others that you would need. I think rolling back or getting rid of subsidies for fossil fuels, for example, is a huge one, I think. It's like 70 billion fossil fuel subsidies a year or something like that, like really huge amounts of this is public investment, but there's also private investment, from banks and things. So there's several others. Yeah.